All right, welcome to part two. And just to clear up some thematic information. So, this is an 8-part series, and actually, with the introduction, it would be 9. But introduction, we have part one, and part one was what I'm going to call now chapters. Chapter one was Descartes, chapter two was Husserl, and chapter three was Bergson. Now we're entering part two, and this is chapter four with Plato. And after chapter four with Plato, we'll go into chapter five and take a look at Heidegger, looking at Aristotle. So, chapter four, Plato, the forgetting of truth and the shadows in the cave. Think of a morning when you wake before dawn and stand at a window, watching darkness slowly transform into light. At first, shapes are barely discernible, silhouettes of trees, the contours of buildings emerging gradually from obscurity. There is a moment, impossible to pin down precisely, when what was hidden becomes visible, when the thing that was always there finally shows itself. This experience of something emerging from concealment to presence, it is what the Greeks named Alētheia, a word we translate as truth, but which carries a meaning far richer than our modern usage suggests. Now, when I was reading Heidegger, I was reading him silently, the inner voice, and I was constantly pronouncing this Alētheia. I got like super attached to that too. And I'm trying to make a practice now of before I, start recording, I look at these words and I want to find like the exact pronunciation instead of like stumbling over them, while I'm recording or just, getting stuck on them. So when I looked up, I just took, Alētheia, the way I used to say it, and I listened to the actual pronunciation, and maybe it's a certain form of Greek. Maybe it's not like, through every form of Greek pronunciation, but the one that I heard was Alētheia. So if you hear me say Alētheia, Alētheia, I'm talking about the exact same thing. And that's a word that translates as truth. But we're going to dig into this a little bit because this is a kind of one of these interesting ancient words that Heidegger kind of transformed. So for the Greeks, as Heidegger would recover through painstaking attention to their language, truth was not primarily a property of statements. It was not the correctness of a proposition. The accurate correspondence between what we say and what is the case. Truth was an event, a happening in which beings emerge from hiddenness and show themselves as they are. The word Alētheia is itself an alpha privative, Alētheia, the state of being not hidden. It names not a static condition, but a dynamic process, the perpetual oscillation between concealment and unconcealment that makes any encounter with beings possible. At least this is how Heidegger reads the Greeks. And it is a reading of enormous power, though not without its challengers. The philologist Paul Friedlander, for instance, he pushed back on Heidegger's etymological claim, arguing that Homer already used Alētheia in connection with correctness of assertion, and that the unhiddenness reading was not the exclusive early Greek meaning. Heidegger himself would later moderate his position, conceding in his 1964 lecture, The End of Philosophy, that Alētheia was originally experienced as orthotes, as correctness, while insisting that this historical fact does not undermine the ontological priority of concealment. So whether we accept Heidegger's reading as philological fact or interpretive provocation, it is the lens through which we read Plato. Well, the lens which we read Heidegger reading Plato. And it is the reading that shaped everything he subsequently wrote. Heidegger discovered this original Greek experience of truth in his 1931-32 lecture, The Course on Plato's Cave Allegory in the Theaetetus, later published under the title The Essence of Truth. And what Heidegger discovered there, would become one of the governing insights of his entire philosophical journey. A discovery so consequential that it would reshape how we read every subsequent thinker in the Western tradition. But it was also a reading that, when pressed closely, reveals something about Heidegger's own limitations, about what he could see and what he could not. The Cave Allegory, as Heidegger interprets it, is not merely a pedagogical device about education and enlightenment. It is a meditation on the very essence of truth, a meditation that paradoxically both reveals and conceals what truth originally meant for the Greeks. The prisoners chained in the cave, seeing only shadows on the wall, represent human beings immersed in the sensible world, taking appearances for reality. The shadows are cast by objects carried before a fire, objects the prisoners have never seen. Their entire reality is a play of images, and they have no reason to suspect anything lies behind them. I was going to say beyond them, but you'll be able to follow that logic in a second. Heidegger draws our attention to a crucial detail. The prisoners are not simply mistaken. They are captivated by what they see. They give names to the shadows. They predict their sequences. They even bestow honors on those who can best anticipate what will appear next. This captivation is not ignorance in the simple sense. It is a mode of being in which the world of appearances is taken as the only world. The prisoners are not waiting to be freed because they do not know they are imprisoned. And their lack of any will for freedom, their satisfaction with the shadow play, this is the deepest form of concealment. But here's where Heidegger's reading becomes subtle and strange. He insists that the prisoners are not, strictly speaking, in falsehood. The shadows are not lies, they are unconcealed. The prisoners see what is there to be seen. The problem is not that they see shadows instead of reality, but that they take a derivative unconcealment for the whole. They make the shadows the measure of what can be true. This is the ontological reduction that Heidegger diagnoses. This is not a simple error of perception, but a collapse of the scale of being, a forgetting there are degrees of unhiddenness, that the shadow is true only in a derivative sense, while the thing that casts it is true in a more original sense. The journey upward past the fire into the sunlight toward the forms, this represents the philosophical ascent to knowledge. But Heidegger insists we intend to something the standard interpretations miss. The moment when the prisoner, having ascended to the realms of the forms, is compelled to return to the cave. This compulsion is crucial. The freed prisoner does not choose to descend. He is drawn back by a responsibility to those imprisoned. And here Heidegger finds the original meaning of Alētheia, still flickering beneath the surface of Plato's text. Truth as an event of unconcealment that happens to us, that claims us, that we do not master but rather serve. The philosopher's task is not to accumulate knowledge in the safety of the upper realm, but to endure the dangerous work of bringing light into the darkness, of allowing what is hidden to show itself. Truth, in this original sense, is not a possession. It is a struggle, polemos, a combat against concealment that never fully triumphs, because concealment is not an enemy to be defeated, but the condition that makes revelation possible. Before moving on to the Theaetetus, I just want to mention, you can check this out in Plato's book, Republic, and it's chapter 7, if you haven't, or sorry, book 7. Book 7. See all of these categorical things. Okay. Yes. The Republic, Plato's Republic, and it's book 7. And that's where you can actually read the allegory of the cave. That's where it happens. It's about like a 28 to 30 page read, I guess, something along those lines. And you can get an idea of what Heidegger was talking about here. The Theaetetus and the transformation of truth. Yet, and this is the pivot upon which Heidegger's entire reading turns, something changes in Plato's doctrine. To see this change, Heidegger turns to the Theaetetus, the dialogue in which Socrates investigates the question, what is knowledge? The dialogue's central attempt to define knowledge comes from when Theaetetus proposes that knowledge is a true judgment with an account. Alētheis doxa meta logo. Now, I don't know if I pronounced that right. But now we must be precise here. The Theaetetus is an aporetic dialogue. It ends in perplexity. So Plato did this with a lot of his works where it just ends open-ended. For instance, I've already released 6 episodes on Plato on another playlist, and you'll see the Euthyphro or even the Apology. I mean, they end on cliffhangers where it's left up to you to kind of sort out, what your values are, what you think, and to continue conversations. I mean, it's quite genius when you think about it. So in the Theaetetus, Socrates examines this definition, the definition of, what is knowledge. He finds it wanting and ultimately rejects it along with the others. The dialogue closes without a satisfactory answer. So when Heidegger turns to this text, he is not treating Theaetetus' proposal as Plato's settled dogma. Rather, he diagnoses the very attempt to secure knowledge through logos, through the giving of an account, as symptomatic of a deeper shift. The fact that Plato sets Socrates, to push the inquiry to the point of collapse does not undo the shift. It reveals that the question of knowledge has already been framed in a way that makes the original experience of truth unreachable. In the Theaetetus, truth becomes increasingly tied to the correctness of assertion. Knowledge is no longer an experience of beings emerging from concealment. It is the securing of a proposition that accurately represents what is. The soul's dialogue with itself, thinking as the silent conversation of the soul, becomes the inner space where truth is validated. And this validation, Heidegger argues, presupposes that truth is no longer an event, but a property of statements. The Alētheia that the Cave Allegory, still preserved as a happening of disclosure, begins in the Theaetetus. Its long transformation into orthotes, correctness. As Heidegger observed in those 1931-32 lectures, the determination of truth as correctness of the assertion is not false, but it is not original. It covers over the original essence of truth, not in the sense of destroying it, but in the sense of no longer letting it be seen as what it is, the unhiddenness of beings. This covering over is not an error. It is not that Plato was wrong. Something more subtle occurred. The original experience of truth as disclosure was gradually replaced by a derivative, but practically powerful understanding of truth as propositional correctness. The eidos, the idea, the form, becomes that which makes truth possible. The ideas are the eternal, unchanging beings that grant unhiddenness to the changing things of the sensible world. But in this very granting, truth ceases to be an event and becomes a standard, a measure by which the correctness of our judgments is assessed. And once this covering over occurred, it set in motion a trajectory that would define the entire subsequent history of Western thought. Truth became correspondence, accuracy, the adequation of intellectual and thing, and the question of unconcealment, of what it means for beings to show themselves at all. This was forgotten. What then did Heidegger collect from Plato? He collected the insight that truth has a history, that its meaning has undergone transformation and can therefore be recovered and transformed again. He collected the recognition that the most fundamental experiences of a philosophical tradition can be forgotten without being explicitly denied, that they can withdraw into the background while continuing to operate in hidden ways. He collected the methodological conviction that careful attention to the language of a philosophical text, to what is said and what remains unsaid, can recover dimensions of meaning that the tradition itself has buried. And above all, he collected the question that would govern his entire career. How did truth become correctness? This is not a minor historical curiosity. It is the question that opens the entire field of Heidegger's deconstruction, the question that makes it necessary to go back through the tradition in order to recover what was left behind. Heidegger incorporated Alētheia into his own work as a lens. When he turned to Aristotle, he asked whether Aristotle preserved or obscured the original experience of truth. When he read Kant, he sought the moments where Kant glimpsed the transcendental imagination as a faculty of disclosure before retreating. When he confronted Nietzsche, he diagnosed Nietzsche's will to power as the final, most thorough forgetting of Alētheia. In his own later thought, Heidegger would attempt to think Alētheia in a way that recovered its original depth while acknowledging the transformation it had undergone, an attempt to say what the tradition, beginning with Plato, had left unsaid. All right, so I just want to talk about Plato briefly because I'm simultaneously doing this Heidegger podcast as well as I'm doing a Plato podcast as well. I've written lots of papers, so hopefully if I live long enough, I'm going to release all of these things. But when we look at Plato's Republic and we look at Book 7 and we think about Heidegger's lecture on this book is called The Essence of Truth. It's a book, it's his lecture notes or his transcripts. As we're reading Heidegger's thoughts on these readers, we start to see that Heidegger has a lot of creative liberty. And we can say to ourselves, well, this is kind of also a way of thinking, like I said, like books are like beings. And, Heidegger has these lenses, these ways of looking at things. So the thing is, we can try to think about this as well. What if we were to say, who are these guys that are watching the shadows? Let's think about that. So let's just pause here for a sec, because the cave allegory does not let us stand safely outside of it, right? We're completely immersed. And if we take Heidegger's reading seriously, we must ask, are we, the listeners of this lecture, not ourselves prisoners? When we hear the name Heidegger, when we hear the name Plato, when we handle the concept of truth or the concept forgetting, are we not watching shadows on a wall? Shadows cast by a fire we have never seen? The codex we have been building in this series, right, from the introduction, right, how, from the different ways that Heidegger believes that how we are time, our future projection, our present, we're historical creatures, this kind of thing. For all its power, it does not exempt us from the cave. And it actually places us inside of it, watching a shadow play of philosophical concepts. And the question is whether we are content with those shadows or whether we feel the pull of something else. Are we being pulled outside the way that Heidegger believes that the one man that broke free and led himself outside of the cave, like that was a pull, right? Something was pulling him to do this. And when we investigate philosophical concepts and we listen to these creative ways, like if you listen to lectures by Harold Bloom, he literally, while he's telling you his stories, he's teaching you how to think. He's teaching you how to process novels and how to, get really inside of them. And that's the question here. Like, are these the shadows, these different ways of looking at reality, like all of this reality, shadows dancing on the wall? And I mean, this is not merely rhetorical. Heidegger himself would have insisted that Dasein is always in untruth as well as truth, that we are always fallen, always in the they, the Das Man, always to some degree watching shadows. But there is a deeper challenge here, one that Plato's text itself might pose to Heidegger's reading. And it is a challenge we must take seriously. Is it really a prison to stare at static images on a wall? If there is no will to freedom, if we don't have the thought, the cognition that, oh, well, what, is what opposed to this will be freedom, are we really prisoners? Are we trapped? The prisoners in the cave, they do not know they are imprisoned. They give names to the shadows. They compete in predicting them. They take pleasure in their world. Might there not be a kind of freedom in this? A freedom of interpretation, of imagination, of meaning making, even within the constraints of the cave? What if the prisoners, by interpreting the shadows, are engaging in something that is not merely passive captivation, but an active creative encounter with what appears? And what about the ones who return? The freed prisoner who descends back into the cave does so with a vision of the forms. But the text tells us that upon returning, his eyes are filled with darkness. He stumbles. He cannot see the shadows as well as those who never left. The prisoners mock him. They say his journey upward has ruined his sight, and they are not entirely wrong. The one who has seen the forms has lost something, the ability to navigate the shadow world with fluency. Is this not a kind of tragedy? The philosopher, having ascended, becomes useless in the cave. And Plato knows this. The Republic is not a blueprint for a perfect society. It is a drama in which the philosopher's return is impossible to complete. The philosopher kings are the ones who cannot make it back up. They are forced to rule, and in ruling, they remain in the twilight, caught between the light of the forms and the darkness of the cave. And I do want to mention Heidegger does think through the fact that, of course, going into the light, it takes time for the eyes to adjust, just like coming from light, going into the darkness. And this is the part that Heidegger talks about education, this adjustment period, learning something or having to relearn it. But the fact is that the person affected from the outside with the true forms, when they go back in, at first they are blind. And even after the adjustment phase happens, after the relearning phase happens, they are never the same again. Plato's sanctuary and Heidegger's abyss. And now this brings us to the deepest point of tension between Plato and Heidegger. Heidegger reads the transformation of truth in Plato as a forgetting, a covering over the original experience of Alētheia. But there is another way to hear Plato, and it is a way that Heidegger's lens may have filtered out. For Plato, the forms are not a forgetting of being. They are the nature of the living form, the containment field of reality itself. Plato's sanctuary is in death. Socrates goes to his death calmly in the Phaedo because he believes the soul will be reunited with the forms, with the true reality that the body obscures. This is not the bottomless ground of Heidegger's being toward death, where authenticity is the resolute anticipation of finitude. It is the place of reunion, where the soul returns to what it always was. Heidegger's existential temporality is driven by the future, by the projection toward death, by this finite, this finitude, the end. That's what Heidegger says gives us all this meaning, is our fear of the nothing. Plato's temporality, if we can call it that, is driven by eternity, by the pull of that which is always, the good beyond being, which gives being its light, but it's not itself subject to becoming. One might push back on Heidegger's reading here and suggest that being is not outside of life, that being is what everything is doing at once, and that no single thinker, no matter how radical, can stand outside that totality and name it. Plato transcended the cave, perhaps only imaginatively, but the transcendence of the imagination is still this vision of transcendence. And the ones left inside the cave, staring at shadows and believing them to be reality, these are not the masses alone. They are also the philosophers who could not make the ascent, the ones who remain within the structures of temporality and finitude, unable to see what lies beyond them. I should be careful here. Heidegger's later work, From Time and Being to the Fourfold to the Advent of Appropriation, strains precisely against the limits of subjective temporality. Whether he succeeds in thinking beyond finitude is a question his texts keep open, but the clash remains. When we read the Cave Allegory through Heidegger's lenses, his codex, we see the temporal ecstasies at play, the prisoners lost in the fallen present, the ascent as a retrieval of a forgotten past, the return as a futural projection toward responsibility. But when we read it through Plato's own eyes, we see something completely different. We see a soul that is not merely temporal, but eternal, a truth that is not merely unconcealment, but the good, a freedom that is not merely the owning of one's death, but the release from becoming altogether. So, what is the takeaway from Plato then? The takeaway from Plato then is it's not a simple story of forgetting. It is the opening of a wound that Western philosophy has never fully healed. Heidegger's reading of Plato recovers a dimension of truth that the tradition had buried. Truth as unconcealment, as an event, as a happening that claims us. But in doing so, it also reveals the limits of Heidegger's own thought, his difficulty in thinking eternity except as a derivative of temporality, his reduction of the good to a function of disclosure, his insistence that the only authentic response to finitude is the resolute anticipation of death. What Heidegger collected from Plato was the question of truth and its history, but what he could not collect, what resisted his reading, was Plato's vision of a reality that is not defined by time, a sanctuary that is not the abyss, but the fullness of presence. And this resistance is not a failure of Heidegger's philosophy. It is the sign that the encounter between these two thinkers is still alive, that the cave still holds its prisoners, that the shadows still dance on the wall, and that the question of truth remains as unsettled as it was when the first philosopher turned toward the light. And it is precisely this unsettled question that will accompany us as we turn to the thinker who was Plato's greatest student. And in many ways, he was also Plato's most powerful rival. If Plato initiated the forgetting of truth in the elevation of the forms, it was Aristotle who first gave that forgetting systematic form, and who also paradoxically preserved in his analysis of practical wisdom and the modes of truth something that Heidegger would mine for his own recovery of being. Preserved in his analysis of practical wisdom and the modes of truth something that Heidegger would mine for his own recovery of being. Where Plato left us with the idea as the measure of being, Aristotle left us with the question, what is being, asked in a new way, and with a concept of truth as the activity of the soul in accordance with the real that would haunt the tradition down to its modern end. It is to Aristotle that we now turn. So this is chapter 5, Aristotle, being in its temporal depth. You know, it's actually impossible to imagine our lives without Aristotle. He did not invent mechanical devices or physical machines, but he invented the very frameworks of thought that make science and philosophy possible. He gave us formal logic. Discovering the validity of an argument is determined by the structure rather than its content. He created the syllogism, that three-part engine of reasoning. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. He founded zoology, classifying living beings by their shared characteristics, separating the vertebrates from the invertebrates, long before anyone understood what a vertebrae was. He carved human knowledge into distinct disciplines: biology, physics, psychology, politics, meteorology, and gave each its own terrain. he named metaphysics itself, though those treatises placed by ancient editors meta ta physica after the books on physics, that would ask the most radical question any mind can ask. What is being? He gave us the four causes: the material, formal, efficient, and final. That framework for explaining why things exist or change. He gave us the golden mean, that ethical vision of virtue is the precise balance between excess and deficiency. He is not merely a figure in the history of philosophy. He is the Titan upon whose shoulders the entire Western tradition stands. And the relationship between his thought and Heidegger's, this dialogue across 2 millennia, will be written about as long as there are thinkers left to write. Before we probe into that origin of why there is something rather than nothing, before we ask what is being in its deepest sense, we must understand that Aristotle was the first to pose these questions with systematic rigor. And Heidegger knew it. Heidegger's engagement with Aristotle is not the polite reading of a historian reconstructing a dead system. It was a living confrontation, a hand-to-hand struggle with the thinker who had set the terms for the entire subsequent tradition. As Heidegger once said, his aim was not to say something new, but to say what the ancients had already intended, to recover the originary experience that had been buried beneath centuries of scholastic commentary. Consider a seed, not a seed from a nursery pack, neatly labeled and categorized, but a seed in the moment before germination. Small, hard, and it's apparently inert, a thing that nevertheless carries within itself the entire trajectory of a tree: roots descending, trunk ascending, branches reaching toward light, leaves unfurling to catch the sun. In that seed, what is present is not merely a tiny object, but a potentiality directed towards its own future actualization. The seed is what it will become, not in the mode of already being it. Its being is fundamentally temporal, orientated toward what it is not yet, drawn forward by its own inner directedness. Aristotle called this directedness dunamis, potentiality, capacity, the power to become what one is not yet. And he called the unfolding toward which this potentiality is directed energeia, actuality, being at work, the full realization of what something is. These terms, which occupy the central books of Aristotle's metaphysics, are not merely categories in a classification system. As Heidegger would argue in his 1931 lecture course on metaphysics, Theta, they are names for fundamental ways in which being manifests itself. And what Aristotle grasped more profoundly than any subsequent thinker before Heidegger himself was that being is not static, but in motion, that the being of a thing consists not in its mere presence, but in its unfolding. Heidegger's engagement with Aristotle shaped his development in ways scholars are still uncovering. In his early Freiburg and Marburg periods, the years leading up to Being in Time, Heidegger immersed himself in Aristotle's texts with an intensity difficult to overstate. In 1922, he composed the essay known as the Natorp Report, Phenomenological Interpretations with Respect to Aristotle, in which he argued that Aristotle must be read destructively, not to demolish him, but to dismantle the sedimented tradition that had covered over his originary insights. Then in the summer of 1924 at Marburg, Heidegger delivered a lecture course on the basic concepts of Aristotelian philosophy, based on Aristotle's rhetoric and Nicomachean ethics. The audience included students who had themselves become giants of 20th century thought. Hannah Arendt, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Hans Jonas, Karl Lowith, Leo Strauss. As Gadamer later recalled, these lectures wiped away the scholastic overlay and allowed Aristotle to come to language like a contemporary. What did Heidegger find in these texts? He found that Aristotle had already discovered what Heidegger would call Alētheia, truth as unconcealment. In the winter semester of 1925-26, Heidegger gave a course titled Logic, the Question of Truth, in which he dismantled three prejudices that had dominated philosophy for centuries. That truth resides primarily in the proposition, that truth means correspondence between thought and thing, and that Aristotle himself had originated these errors. Heidegger showed that Aristotle had done nothing of the sort. As Aristotle himself wrote, the proposition is defined not as the locus of truth, but as the mode of speech in which truth or falsity can occur. The logos, apophantikos, the assertive statement, is a letting be seen, and apophansis, and truth is the uncovering that makes this seeing possible. Truth for Aristotle was never merely correctness. It was unhiddenness, the emergence of beings from concealment. But Heidegger went further. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, Aristotle distinguishes 5 modes of truth, 5 ways the soul discloses being: techne, the know-how of making; episteme, the knowledge of necessary truths; phronesis, the practical wisdom of deliberating about the good life; sophia, the contemplative wisdom of first principles; and nous, the intellectual intuition that grasps arche. These are not merely cognitive categories. They are modes of alētheion, ways of being in truth. And Heidegger saw in phronesis something extraordinary. Phronesis is not theoretical knowledge about universal laws. It is the capacity to see what is best for oneself here and now. In this singular situation, it requires experience, maturity, and a kind of perceptiveness that cannot be reduced to rules. As Heidegger read it, phronesis is the mode of disclosure proper to practical existence, and it provided Heidegger with a model for what he would later call authentic existence, the resolute facing of one's own singular situation. The key insight, however, concerned the question of being itself. Aristotle had asked T tuon, what is being, and answered that being is said in many ways. Palakos legete. Being is not a genus under which all beings can be subsumed. Rather, being is said in many ways, analogically related with visa, typically translated as substance, but more properly as presence, serving as the primary sense. But here Heidegger introduces a crucial question. If visa names the primary way being is said, and if it means presence and Wasenheit, then what understanding of time governs this prioritization? Aristotle's answers in the physics is that time is the sequence of nows. What is most fully real is what is present now, fully actualized. The potential has a derivative being, really only as pointing toward actualization. This privileging of the present is not accidental. It reflects a fundamental experience of being pervading the Western tradition. Being is understood as presence, as what stands before us, as what can be grasped in the now. This understanding, while capturing something genuine, is one-sided. Being is not merely presence. It is also absence, withdrawal, concealment. The future and past are not derivative modes of the present. They have their own manner of making beings manifest. Heidegger argued that Aristotle's text contains resources for thinking, being more originally dunamis. Potentiality as directedness towards future actualization. It contains a temporal dimension that Aristotle's official doctrine cannot fully accommodate. When Aristotle describes the energeia of seeing as ongoing activity rather than static state, or the energeia of living as ongoing activity rather than possessed property, he gestures toward a temporal understanding that exceeds his own framework. The seed is not merely a deficient tree. It is a being whose very being is stretched out toward what it is not yet. Yet Aristotle still privileges energeia. The fully present actuality is the highest mode of being. God, for Aristotle, the prime mover, is pure energeia without any dunamis. Thought thinking itself, eternally present. And here is the limit that Heidegger diagnosed. The tradition's understanding of being as presence, which Aristotle gave its classical formulation, this obscures the temporal depth that makes presence itself possible. It forgets that every present is haunted by a past and open toward a future, that being is fundamentally temporal in its essence. So, what did Heidegger collect from Aristotle? He collected the question of being in its radical simplicity, the question that Aristotle was the first to ask systematically, and that every subsequent metaphysics would presuppose. He collected the insight that being is said in many ways, irreducible to a single definition. An insight that would become the model for Heidegger's own ontological pluralism. He collected the recognition that being is fundamentally temporal, unfolding rather than static presence. Even if Aristotle himself could not fully think this temporality, he collected the methodological model of phenomenological reading, allowing a text to disclose its subject through attention to its language rather than through imposed categories. He collected the concept of truth as unconcealment, that Alētheia or Alētheia, and the recognition that the proposition is not the original locus of truth, but a derivative mode of letting be seen. And he collected the diagnosis that would govern his entire project. The privileging of presence obscures the withdrawing dimension of being, the way it both reveals and holds itself back. This diagnosis became the central thread of being in time. The concept of Dasein radicalizes Aristotle's zoon logon ichon, the animal that has speech, into a being whose very existence is constituted by its understanding of being. The analysis of equipmentality draws on Aristotle's techne and phronesis, the concept of repetition, Wiederholung, that German again. Anyways, the concept of repetition by which Heidegger retrieves the question of being from the tradition, it mirrors Aristotle's own project of reawakening a buried question, and the temporal analysis of Division 2, with its concepts of thrownness, projection, and fallenness, is the direct fruit of Heidegger's long engagement with Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. The takeaway from Aristotle, then, is this: being is temporal in its essence, and the tradition's understanding of being as presence, while genuine, obscures the temporal depth that makes presence itself possible. Aristotle asked, "What is being?" And in asking, he opened a field of inquiry that would define Western thought. Heidegger asked the same question again, more originally, and discovered that the answer had been hidden, not by a mistake, but by a way of experiencing time itself. Every subsequent thinker would be measured against this standard, against whether they preserved or forgot the temporal character of being. And having established this temporal horizon through our confrontation with Aristotle, we now see why the question of time became, for Heidegger, inseparable from the question of being, and why the thinker who would next command his attention had to be the one who pursued the reality of time and movement with a radicality that matched Aristotle's own.